favorite question, is my faith unraveling? I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and thanks so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. Joining me today is my new friend, Angela Lam, who works with Boundless and Hagar's Voice and shares about a time she truly met God. And the timing just might surprise you.
And then I would say, there's so much hope in the unraveling. I mean, I still only know a fraction of who God is, but it is so much more than what I had when I had God in those boxes.
Here's my conversation with Angela Lam. Well, I'd have to say one of the secrets about being on a podcast or having a podcast is that this is my opportunity to get to know people and just call it a podcast. So I am thrilled to introduce you to Angela Lam today. And we met back in February of this year in the mountains of Utah. How fancy is that?
That's a good story.
It is. Well, first, welcome. I do have a fun story to share, but thank you so much for being here.
Hi. Oh, so happy to be here. Love a good conversation. If you happen to record it, there it is.
Okay, so the first time ever we met, that night, everybody at this retreat was doing a cold plunge. Never in my life have I experienced that. It was darn cold outside. But let me just tell you, the way that you supported me, I felt like you were a cold plunge doula. It was just so amazing. Usually I probably would have been out in 20 seconds, but you and then this other guy, Ryan, were just walking me through it. And I was like, this is such a cool experience. And I'm going to write it down because I feel like it's an analogy for a message right here. So anyways.
That'll preach. Yeah, you made it the full 3 minutes on your first go.
I couldn't feel my body, but I did it.
No. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, Ann, why cold plunge for you? How did you get introduced to that?
Yeah, I like it. I do it fairly regularly. Like a lot of good stories, it starts with a friend who has a contagious idea and you're like, I'm in. Okay, let's give it a go. But the reason why I actually did it was I have quite a bit of trauma in my history. And so I do things to support my nervous system. And this thing is incredibly impactful. It's basically a nervous system reboot in 3 minutes. And those of us that pay attention to our nervous system and need to actually kind of help and support it, that is a huge return on investment. It's cold water, for crying out loud. I feel rebooted. It is almost like the reboot button on any device.
Yeah.
So 3 minutes of cold. Yeah. It's cold.
You train service dogs. I just need to hear more about that. How did that begin? Do you just love dogs and you're like, listen, I want to train them? Or is this something brand new to you?
Oh, no, I've been doing it since right after I got out of college. And my parents, I somewhat blame them. I have a bit of a rebellious nature and I was not allowed pets growing up originally. Okay. Well, my parents had a cat when they were newlyweds and it died tragically, and they were so brokenhearted about Jeremy that they swore off pets. And then my older two siblings were totally chill with that. That was fine. But I swear I came out of the womb somehow affiliated with animals. I remember going over to other people's houses and on the way there asking my parents, do they have a pet, do you think? I just wanted, so animals and I are a thing. Yeah. So my parents cracked when I was 8 and got me my first bird. And then bless their hearts, they've just been along for the ride ever since. I mean, I was bringing home anything that they would let me, but a dog that never broke on that one. Okay. So then after I graduated college, I was fairly determined to get a dog. And I happen to have a job down the street from a service dog organization, Canine Companions for Independence. And I was like, what is this? I had never thought about where service dogs come from. It's kind of like that, where do babies come from? I never thought about it. And I got on their website and they're like, hand a puppy to a novice like me and train you on how to have the world's most well-behaved dog. That felt like the perfect combination, because if the dog wants to do this job, then off they go to advocate for someone who deserves any leg up that they can get in life. So that's amazing. And if not, then you have the world's most well-behaved dog as a pet. So it felt like a win-win that I would actually get trained. So it was this cool mutuality thing. I genuinely loved what service dogs do in the world. Mm-hmm. And then when I realized I could be part of it, but then also they were going to train me on how to have a well-behaved dog, that was cool too. So then I was hooked. So I'm like 25, 30-ish years into it now.
What is something that maybe has surprised you about training dogs?
It's made me a much better human and pastor. Like big time.
Yeah.
Because you can mistreat an animal
sure.
and maybe you can get some form of compliance out of them. Mm-hmm. But in truth, the best partnerships are based on influence, mutuality, and affection.
Yeah.
Like dogs will give you immediate feedback, kind of like children. They will give you immediate feedback on whether or not they actually believe that you're working in their best interest or not. Mm-hmm. So they're like incredibly unfiltered and unnuanced. So you're constantly getting feedback on what your motivations are, whether your tactics are working or not, whether you're actually influencing or coercing. I mean, that was surprising to me.
Yeah. Angela, what would you say is like something that you're very passionate about these days?
I think these days I'm spending a lot of time relishing the things, a couple of really clear patterns that I can see in my life all the way back. So I feel incredibly passionate about advocacy right now. Well, actually, I realized that I have built my life around advocacy and I didn't do that on purpose necessarily.
Wow.
So when I pulled up and was like, oh, that's so interesting. I'm advocating there. Like, that's just a thing. I'm realizing I go back to elementary school, preschool. I have memories of advocating that I didn't know that word. I don't remember. My family is deeply compassionate and empathetic. And so I would have received a lot of encouragement in this way. But I can look back and be like, oh, there was something inside of me. So advocacy is a thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about these days. But I realize that's actually all the way back. I think that's kind of the definition of a gift. It's just there.
That's so good. I think sometimes when we wonder what our passions are, we kind of can look back into those spaces, even like early on, like those central pieces of who we are, those passion pieces. We can see how God has just been so good to weave that through our lives that it's almost become natural. Like that's just who we are. That's so lovely. And you guys recently moved to Vancouver. So tell me, was this more of an adventure or was this planned? What was it like for you?
So we moved here from Toronto. We had been in Toronto for 2 years, having moved from California, where we thought we would spend our entire lives. So then when we felt like nudged to go to Toronto, we've also still had that sort of like, okay, this is our forever spot because community is so important to us. So I think I just defaulted to this, our forever spot. So we're only there 2 years. We're still trying to figure out how to make roots, like deep roots. And my husband, who is the steady Eddie of our relationship, I am usually the harebrained pitching some kind of idea that's maybe a little past logic and into something else. So my husband randomly is like, what do you think about Vancouver? And I was like, ha, boop, and just moved on. He comes back a few weeks later. He was like, I don't know why we're not having a real conversation about Vancouver, which I'm like, bless his heart. I'm glad he tried again. So I was like, what do you mean? Like, we're trying to build roots here. We've invested a couple of years. Like, this is the thing. Anyway, he basically gave me my own sales pitch. It was magnificent. And it's so funny to me that it took me that long to like catch on. So within 45 minutes of him being like, why aren't we seriously talking about Vancouver? We had actually decided to move to Vancouver. Wow. And I told people at the time, I'm truly following my husband's sense of adventure because this is so fun to be on the other side of the coin. That being said, it was so obvious that this was not just this harebrained scheme. First of all, apparently he'd been thinking about it for a really long time. And secondly, it opened up the door for us to move into a community. So we both have jobs that were very portable.
Yeah.
And we had been I had been volunteering at a refugee transitional housing community in Toronto. And we were on the wait list to be live-in hosts at that place. They just didn't have a spot for us. So when we started to talk about Vancouver, we popped on we asked them, who do you recommend? And they mentioned this place that we are currently at. So in the midst of this like harebrained scheme of, I wonder if we should move to Vancouver for a little bit, has turned into a whole adventure of living in a transitional community for refugee claimants that is like, this is the way it was meant to live. Like, so we're having a ball. It's hard. It's like we're living like in each other's business. So that's a real thing. And it's a transition for both of us and our different relationships to this transition. It's a lot of work to move. That's a thing.
Yeah.
So it's not easy, but good. So good.
Yeah. So just to clarify, in a transitional community, does that mean like you guys are living in an apartment complex? Are people living with you and you're just helping them? What does that look like?
So the organization that we're partnered with is called Kin Brace, and they are full service, amazing partnership to refugee claimants who are newcomers to Canada, and they're not immigrants, they're refugees. So they have come out of some level of distress and they have landed here with zero paperwork and zero whatever. Well, Canada has a pretty decent system for that, but there's this pocket of time where you can't get a job because you don't have the right paperwork, and you can't get housing because you don't have a job, and it's terrifying. So Kin Brace is like a full service partnership on that. But one of the things that really matters to them is not just how do we help people navigate this scary season, but how do we actually help them feel welcome to Canada and at home and not alone. And so, yes, it's a live-in situation. In where I live, there's 2 houses next to each other, and they have 9 dwelling units. And we live in one of the apartments. There's a couple of other host community is what we're called, who are also just making this transitional community not feel transitional. So while people come through here for like 6-ish months, we want it to feel like home and well established. So it's a soft landing place. Actually, my husband and I don't actually do any of the work. There's a whole team that does work. We literally are friends. Like that's our job, is to be neighbors. And oh man, we love it.
It's so beautiful how that just connects back to what you were saying your passion is, advocating and like building like this community, home, welcoming others. I love that. And I was talking to a coach the other day, and she was kind of like, as you're at this point in your life, when you're looking forward, because our life is creative in a sense, like we don't know where it's going. Is it like you are making a new movie? Is it like you're making a sequel? Or is it time that you want to rewatch the original?
Oh, I'm absolutely in new movie mode.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I didn't know it when we moved out of California. That wasn't on my radar. But I mean, I don't even know how to describe all of the various ways that it was like, oh, that was the end of something. Oh, that was the end. I mean, our world is so small, you know, with my air quotes, it's so small that we absolutely can move over a border and across a continent and still be deeply connected to the community that we had been in. And we are still, but with that came a whole lot of other things that I did not foresee. So it ended up about 3 years ago starting an entirely new plot line. Yeah. that we are like very happily living into. I just did not see that coming, but the word that I think of is relish, just really relishing. But I am an Enneagram 7 wing 8, which also makes some sense about the advocacy, but I love change. I love new, even when it is hard work. I am invigorated by that. So the new movie mode has suited us well. My steady Eddie husband, that's what's like so fun to watch. As part of how you know, like you're in the spirit's flow, is that even steady Eddie Jason is like coming alive.
That's lovely. Well, Ange, would you be willing to just share with us one of your parable stories? Just even hearing how you talk about dog training and how God has like brought you through this new adventure season. I cannot wait to hear what you have to share with us today.
I also am a little bit curious to see how this goes, because when I put the prayer time into like, what would I say is a lesson God has taught me? I was drawn to a very specific memory that is like, oh, I'm so curious to see how this story flows out. So truly this will be conversational. I was drawn to what I now consider to be the moment when I feel like I met God, which was in my 30s, which is surprising because I was raised in a Christian Christian home. And by the time I met God, as far as like how I'm describing it today, I had been a pastor for like 15 years already.
Wow.
So
okay.
I feel like that's a confession. Maybe I owe some people some apologies, but I was raised by two pastors as parents, and they had very genuine faith. And so our family had very genuine exploration of our Christian faith. And so I felt like I knew God, and I had deep affection for God, and my parents were gentle and patient and loving. And so my image of God was gentle, patient, and loving. All's well. That's great. So like this moment, this memory that I was drawn to specifically was not a big moment necessarily. I was sitting at the crossroads of a decision, and I'm very visual in my head. Like I don't think in words, I think in pictures.
Yeah.
So I was sitting at this Y in my head, and I was visualizing the left path and the right path. And also the way that it works in my mind, I know that this isn't theologically sound, but God is existing somewhere specifically. And in this case, God was over my right shoulder. So I'm sitting at this Y, and I'm agonizing over a decision, a big life decision. I don't even remember what it was. So how big could it have been? But I felt it keenly. Do I go left or do I go right? And I'm agonizing, and I'm a little annoyed with God for not being like the right answer is to go left. I'm a little annoyed. Anyway, so I sort of throw over my shoulder like, dude, where are you going? I want to go with you. And God's answer, and this is like, I feel like I met God in 4 words. God's answer was, well, I'm going with you. I mean, you know that like guppy, like your mouth opens and closes open, like something broke in me in all the right ways in that moment. Are you by chance a Monty Python fan?
I know what it is, but I could not quote anything for you.
I need to highly recommend Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail, and hold any religious preciousness that you have to the side.
Okay.
It's stinking hilarious. But my favorite scene in it is a king is wanting to imprison his own son by leaving guards at his son's bedroom door because his son wants to live in a musical and consistently keeps breaking out into song, and it's embarrassing to the king. So the king is like locking the son away, and he tries to leave the son under the care of 2 guards. But the guards are ridiculous, and they cannot understand. I don't know how many ways they get it wrong, but basically they keep having a miscommunication about the fact that the king wants them to stay here and keep the son in the room. And at one point, the king turns to leave thinking that he has left clear instructions. He turns to leave, and the guards start to follow him out. And he is like, where are you going? And the guard says, I'm going with you. And that is literally what God said to me, not just the words, but the tone, which is like maybe sacrilegious to hear God's voice in the words and tone of an idiot guard. I mean, that's the whole point to that scene, is the guards are ridiculous. But I'm sitting at this crossroads, and I'm taking it so seriously, and I'm like buckling down, and I need to get it right. And God quotes Monty Python to let me know that I've got my theology wrong. The number of layers. Anyway, so I say I met God because what unraveled out of that moment was the realization that I had God trapped in binary boxes, like left or right. I had a very small G, small God that really was going to punish me if I went down the wrong road. I had a God in my head that was limited to 2 options instead of infinite. I mean, I don't think this is their purpose, but Marvel and their like multiverse thing is truly helping me understand God's infinite nature. And like, how ridiculous is that there is a whole world of options in front of me. I'm agonizing over left and right, and the God of the universe, infinite God, is like, you have no idea. Anyway, so my God was very small. And then also I had no imagination for a God that understood my sense of humor. Like the fact that God didn't answer me. I mean, I was agonizing over this to the point of being irritated with God for not like solving it for me. And here God cracks a joke.
Yeah.
I just didn't have imagination for that God. So I feel like when I was thinking about about, a lesson that God has taught me, I'm like, actually, the lesson was I met God for the first time. And then now more and more and more layers have come. And I have realized that while my narrative of God was gentle and patient and loving, what was being revealed in that agonizing moment at the why was actually not a gentle, patient, and loving God image. It was gotta get it right image. It was I'll punish if you get it wrong image. It was I'm going to stand at this crossroads, and if you go down the wrong road, I'm going to wait here till you come back and fix this, and then we can travel down the right road. It was so many things are revealed to me about my image of God in that moment when God was kind enough to show up. And I wouldn't even say God showed up in God's true form. I think God showed up in a form that I could understand, which just cracks me up. It's Monty Python. And took that moment seriously enough to not join me in me taking that moment too seriously and to pull up and reveal just so many more layers that I knew. So I feel like God taught me God, a piece of God.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I appreciate your honesty in saying I was a pastor. and it just, because I think there's so many of us that either have grown up in our family's faith because this is just what we do. This is how, you understood this. And so I'll understand it in the same way, and digging deeper. Can you take me back to that moment too? Was there anything leading up to that you would ever question, or were you on a path where you're just like, well, this is just how it has to be?
I think the number of times that I had sat as a pastor on the other side of people who were agonizing about their own decisions and trying to discern out the will of God, I think a mirror was being held up to me of I was teaching people a gentle, patient, loving God. Yeah. But when they would come to me agonizing over their own discernment processes, I would teach them about a gentle, patient, and loving God. But I would also imply to them all kinds of I would teach them discernment, methods and things. And there was this assumption that there was one right will of God and that you somehow have to jump through all the hoops to figure out what it is. And if you get it wrong, there's real consequences. And so while I was teaching one image of God, I was implying a whole lot of other things. But then as I watched people agonize and then make good or unhelpful decisions, or I watched other people not agonize at all and make various decisions, I guess basically I was just starting to see some holes in my theology about the will of God that I wasn't having any trouble talking to people who were living in the very real consequences of unwise decisions and talking to them about a gentle, patient, loving God. So I think when I was sitting at that crossroads and God said, well, I'm going with you, part of what broke for me was this idea that God was somehow further down a particular path and not other paths, but down a particular path and was waiting for me to catch on and waiting for me to follow, as opposed to this little movie that I had in my head that day where I was sitting at the crossroads. God was not in front of me. God was behind me. And God basically what has begun to birth out of that is this image of co-creation. We sit together and we talk and we talk about my fears about one path. We talk about the discipleship opportunities of another path. We talk about how much I want a certain path or what's in my control or what's out of my control. And in the midst of those conversations, I'm shaped. And together we decide, well, let's go down this left path. Yeah. But what God was actually saying with the Monty Python quote was, I'm just going wherever you go. I'm with you.
Yeah.
My loyalty's there. Anyway, I think before that, I had some holes that were starting to show in my theology about God's will that would make me susceptible to actually receive that lesson in the quote.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the reality of many of us. I was just having a conversation with our daughter who is 14. She's like, well, what if I choose this or should I choose that? And I feel like even though I gave her almost a similar answer of God is going to go with you. I mean, I still struggle with that as well. Like, you know, because it's just like ingrained in our brain of like, well, if we don't do this the right way. But what you said about the Marvel universe is like, there's so many different spectrums. Our brain can't fathom it. If God can raise his son from the dead, surely if we maybe go off course a bit, I'm confident that he is going to walk with us and help us in that way. That's so good. You said that, you know, there was a bit of an unraveling, that God was trapped in these boxes for you. Yeah. And just to really think bigger. If somebody finds themselves in that space where they're kind of recognizing, oh, wow, I put God in a box. What would be some tips of like how to think bigger to take him out of the box?
Beware, this might get a little bit spicy, but one of the things I would say is reconsider what are the names of those boxes. So binary God, you know, black, white, left, right, wrong, binaries, that. But even then, some of what's unraveled since that moment is my male only vision of God. So like, part of the problem was I intellectually knew about God from what other people had said. And I had for sure, but then I mean, at the time, I was largely reading male authors, not even on purpose. That's just prolifically who's written. So I was primarily reading male authors. I was primarily reading white authors. I was primarily reading privileged authors. I mean, that's obvious because it's male and white, but like I was primarily reading privileged authors. So everybody that had mentored me from a distance or even mostly from close up, like actual proximity to me. So the boxes that God had been put in were not on purpose. They were so limited because the scope of who was in my spiritual influencing community was so limited. So if somebody finds themselves like, oh, I'm like really thinking God has one right will and I got to get it right and I need to just jump through whatever hoops to get God to tell me what that right thing is. First, I would say you're not alone in that. Second, I would say if you find some degree of frustration with that, like that's the beginning of the unraveling and hold on to your hats and glasses because here's the wildest ride in the wilderness. Like that's beautiful. That's really healthy frustration. And then I would say like there's so much hope in the unraveling. I didn't know. I mean, I still only know a fraction of who God is, but it is so much more than what I had when I had God in those boxes. So it can be scary for the first time to consider that God is beyond gender. Like maybe intellectually we're not terribly uncomfortable with that. Like we know we are made in the image of God, but that God is not human because Jesus was fully God and fully human. There's a distinction there. So intellectually it might be okay. But when we stop to picture what parent God is like, do we only picture father God or can we also picture mother God? And what does that change about the tones of these conversations that we're having with the mental image of God? And, you know, if you feel frustration, that's beautiful. On the other side of that is a lot of hope. Yeah. And like, don't be afraid. Like, don't judge backwards and don't be afraid forwards. So like, as you look back, be gentle, patient, and loving. Like there's no better time to begin to unleash God than today. And there may be lament as we look back on the consequences of having an image of God that is not that helpful, but there doesn't need to be judgment. Somehow God has stayed with us in that too. Like we tend to think of God's will as decisions from here to here. But the truth is when I had God all boxed up, I was outside of God's will. That was not God's will. That was, we think of it in decisions, but the truth is I was executing what I now consider a fairly anemic faith because I had God all boxed up. That was not God's will for my life. And yet that's who was sitting at that crossroads as God was like, I'm going with you.
Yeah.
So there doesn't need to be any judgment. Somehow God makes that judgment-free zone. There doesn't need to be any judgment backwards. And then there doesn't need to be any fear forward.
Absolutely. And that's so good. I loved what you said, that there's hope in the unraveling, because there's so much more out there that we get to encounter that he wants for us, or she. See? Look
they?
At
they? Because
I know.
We're on board for the triune God, right? Like generally that's a pretty orthodox concept, but we don't think of they. We have three advocates. They have different roles to play, but
that's something that I think it just goes back because we also have a human brain. So my mind, when I pray, I automatically just go to God, Jesus, Holy Spirit rarely gets in there. Okay. I'm trying my best now to be really mindful of that, because I'm you can ask and pray in different ways. And it's so helpful to think that way, because that is just one step of opening up, what God's doing in your mind. Yep. You talked a little bit about imagination, and that there's freedom in imagination. How has that imagination been a part of your own faith practices or just prayer life in general?
I think this might be one of those things where when you do it naturally, it's hard to talk about it.
Sure.
Okay, so our mutual friend Danielle Strickland leads imaginative prayer practice where you picture your favorite spot on the planet. It might even be a fake spot. It may not be on the planet, but you picture a spot you feel affinity for and safety in. And then you hang out there and invite Jesus to show up. And so Jesus appears into the scene, and then she prompts you with different questions of what have you got on your mind these days, Jesus? You just have this little chat with Jesus. And one of the questions that she asks, you could put any question in there, but one of the questions that she asks when she leads this is, Jesus, what game do you want to play with me? It's fascinating. I've done this thing now several times, and every time the game is different, which shouldn't blow my mind. That shouldn't blow my mind, because if Jesus is a real being with his own mind, personality, interests, seasons of life, which seems funny because he's eternal, it shouldn't surprise me if every time you and I get together for a game night, you're like, I want to play the same game. We'd have to have a chat because my temperament can't take it. I cannot take it. That would not reflect our relationship. That might reflect your personality, but if we had a game night, we played the same game every time, it wouldn't reflect our relationship. So it blows my mind when we do this imaginative prayer exercise and Jesus and I come up with a different game to play every time. But of course we do. Anyway, so that's a very micro answer to your macro question, but that one practice of pick a spot that you're perfectly at ease and that affection just pulls off of you. It just pours out of you, and then invite Jesus into that spot and then ask some maybe unorthodox questions, but maybe the kinds of questions you might ask a friend. If you and I met in Elise's Forest, which is always my go-to spot, I would ask you certain questions because we're friends. No matter if we're newish friends or longtime friends, I wouldn't just sit there and wonder if you're going to talk to me, which I think sometimes that's what we think, or I wouldn't just monologue. Anyway, that imaginative practice has been delightful. Delightful. Actually picturing the three different parts of God as friends that you're trying to get to know. And that you you trust their character. So you want them to influence your thoughts, but you don't just obey your friends. You ask for their counsel. You're like, what do you mean you think I should do this? This sounds miserable. You just talk as though you're friends. How would you engage with your friends? That is probably the best description of my prayer life. Is that kind of conversation happening in what I think is my imagination.
Gosh, that's so good. That's why I love asking people what they do, because it just opens my mind to all these things that I haven't even thought of, because sometimes we get so caught up into this is what I have to do every single day. And gosh, if I didn't check that box off, he's coming for you, Oh gosh. Right?
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm curious. So you were a pastor for quite some time, but now you're working with Boundless and a whole bunch of different initiatives. Can you talk about that transition of recognizing like, hey, there's a different path I'd like to go down?
Well, that was not the plan.
Yeah.
I'm glad God and I had this chat about the binary, but that was not the plan. I didn't plan to be a pastor to begin with. Mm-hmm. I stumbled into that. I am 4th generation pastor, but I'm 1st generation female pastor. And none of us, speaking of imagination, none of us had imagination for that beast being a thing based out of the faith streams that we came from. So when I stumbled into being a pastor, there's just a lot of pastors that is their identity. Like there's been whole generations of pastors that is their identity. So the transition, quote unquote, out of it is a really big deal.
Yeah.
Credentials is not a thing for me. I think, in fact, a lot of things have been harmed by the credentialing process where we have certain people are, quote unquote, experts because they've gone through certain training. And I do think there's a place for religious education and all of that. Like, that's fine. But my credentials and letting those lapse or whatever wasn't a thing for me. Actually, it felt like I had been a pastor in a certain way because I was labeled a pastor and I was holding a more traditional role in that way. But you're absolutely right. I still consider myself a pastor, even though now I maybe call myself an advocate. Yeah. It's the same. It's the same heart space. It's the same skills. It's the same, like it's the same. It's just a different expression of what I was attempting to do with a different title. So it hasn't really felt like much of a transition, with the exception of I feel a lot of freedom. So I didn't leave my official pastoral role in order to get freedom. That's a whole nother story. I just, when I left, what I discovered was there were whole parts of me and my expression that couldn't fully be unleashed because the job description had certain requirements to it. So, you know, you're very oriented to Sunday. There's a lot of things that need to get done by Sunday. I have entrepreneurial giftedness, and that was problematic in a environment. This isn't about that particular church. It's just problematic in an environment where you can't constantly be creating new things. Like you just can't. So there was transition for sure, but it actually felt in a lot of ways like an unleashing of myself. So I feel incredibly grateful to have gone through the process of identifying as a pastor and the transition that required for me to see a woman that way, and then to be a woman who was talking about that journey to other women who also needed to make that transition, and men who needed to see that transition is a thing. I'm very grateful for the season that I felt drawn to that word. And also that I am very grateful for this season where I get a little bit fuller expression of myself in a different context. If that makes any sense.
I mean, that goes back to the beginning of our conversation, how God is so good, where he wants to see the full expression of who we are, who he created us to be, and how he's going to utilize that, whether that is in our vocation or just who we are, like who you are to your neighbors. Like, it's so beautiful, Ange. And I'm grateful to have this conversation today and just to hear a little bit more about you. So, and if people want to get connected to you, how can they do that? I don't
know. I mean, I'm on Facebook and Instagram, but I'm not a content creator. So like, I put stuff out there. It's a mixed bag of me passing on all kinds of activist-y things and then randomly dog pictures. Like today I posted a prairie dog eating a carrot. Like, I don't know. I don't think my feed is, I'm out there. You can find me and we can connect on whatever it is, but I'm on socials, and then that's probably the best way. But good luck to you there.
All of Angela's information and that prairie dog link will be in the comments. Gosh, thank you so much, Ange, for just sharing your heart and being honest and helping us really think. You know, there's so much freedom in thinking outside the box. Thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
It's delightful.
I think I'm going to be thinking about the Marvel Universe for some time now when I come to decisions, just because that really helps my brain as much as we can as a human attach ourselves to what God is doing and just know that it's so much bigger than we ever imagine. All of our questions and our wonder or what ifs, God is so much bigger. And so I'm just grateful for the time I got to spend with Angela today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. To connect with Ange, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com. We also have a whole bunch of links in there for every organization that she mentioned today. Here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Ange. Number 1, I'd love for you to spend some time in prayer and imagine yourself in that safe space. What does it look like? Where is it? Ange talked about how the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are our friends. And so what do you want to talk to them about? What do you want to ask them? What game do you want to play with them? Just spend some time really being imaginative and having fun with the idea of, what is God? What is the Holy Spirit? What is Jesus trying to tell me this week? Number 2, what can you do to think outside of the box? What voices are you listening to? Do they sound and look the same? Like Angela said, we just think, oh, I'm listening to this. I'm reading that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. One of the things that helped me is kind of look, who am I following on Instagram? If everybody looks the same, there may be a problem. So just to be thinking about that, whether that's on your social media, on the books that you read, the types of programs or people or podcasts you listen to, we want to dip a toe into the beauty of what God's community looks like. It is so vast and vivid and bold and so many different facets. And so think outside the box this week. Thanks so much to my brilliant producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so great. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how there is hope in the unraveling. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.